You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. A glossary-first approach provides the foundation for success in the CIPP-US exam because precision in terminology is essential. The language of privacy law is dense, technical, and often counterintuitive, and misunderstandings of even a single term can lead to flawed reasoning across entire domains. Domains I and II establish the building blocks, the broader U.S. privacy environment, and the federal statutes that define sector-specific obligations. Without fluency in these terms, it is difficult to understand how laws interlock, how regulators enforce compliance, or how organizations must adapt their practices. By working systematically through these definitions, candidates create a vocabulary base that allows them to process legal frameworks quickly and accurately. This deep dive is not about memorizing definitions in isolation, but about understanding how terms operate in context, shaping the relationships between principles, rules, and enforcement mechanisms. The United States legal framework reflects the separation of powers across three branches of government, each affecting privacy in distinct ways. The legislative branch enacts statutes, such as HIPAA or GLBA, that directly impose privacy and security obligations. The executive branch, through agencies like the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Health and Human Services, issues regulations and enforces compliance. The judiciary interprets both statutes and constitutional provisions, creating case law that refines obligations through precedent. Together, these branches form a system of checks and balances, where privacy law evolves dynamically through legislative enactments, regulatory interpretations, and judicial rulings. For learners, recognizing these distinct roles clarifies why privacy law is often described as a patchwork. Authority is dispersed across multiple entities, each shaping the field in ways that intersect but do not always align neatly. Understanding the sources of law in privacy governance helps structure the field into recognizable categories. Constitutions provide overarching rights, such as protections against unreasonable searches under the Fourth Amendment. Statutes are legislative enactments like COPPA or FERPA, which apply to specific industries or populations. Regulations translate statutory mandates into operational detail, such as HIPAA's privacy and security rules. Case law refines the interpretation of both statutes and constitutional principles, adding nuance to what privacy obligations mean in practice. Contracts, especially in data processing and service agreements, add another layer by imposing obligations voluntarily adopted between private parties. This multi-layered system means that privacy compliance often requires navigating multiple overlapping authorities. For candidates, distinguishing these sources ensures that when a question references a law, they can immediately situate it within the appropriate category and apply the correct reasoning. Jurisdiction and scope determine whether a law applies in a given situation, making them critical for interpretation. Federal statutes often have sectoral scope, applying only to specific industries, such as healthcare under HIPAA or education under FERPA. State laws may extend protections more broadly, covering residents regardless of sector. Scope also includes geographic reach. Some statutes apply nationally, while others, like the California Consumer Privacy Act, apply only within state borders but may affect companies operating across the country. Jurisdiction questions often test whether a particular activity falls within or outside a law's coverage. For example, does the collection of children's data by a general interest website trigger COPPA obligations? Recognizing jurisdiction and scope prevents overgeneralization and ensures candidates understand that privacy compliance is rarely universal, but instead highly context-dependent. The doctrine of preemption plays an important role when federal and state laws conflict. Preemption arises when federal law supersedes state law, either explicitly or implicitly. For example, federal statutes governing credit reporting can override inconsistent state laws in that area. However, where preemption does not apply, states may impose stricter obligations, creating a layered compliance burden. This tension is especially visible in privacy, where federal laws are sector-specific and state laws often attempt broader coverage. For learners, understanding preemption means recognizing both the limits of state power and the importance of federal supremacy. Exam questions may test whether state laws survive alongside federal frameworks, and professionals must navigate these conflicts in practice. Appreciating preemption clarifies why the U.S. lacks a single comprehensive privacy statute, instead relying on both federal baselines and state-level innovation. Private rights of action and legal standing define who can bring claims under privacy law. A private right of action allows individuals, rather than just regulators, to sue for violations. For example, the Fair Credit Reporting Act provides consumers with this power, enabling lawsuits against credit bureaus for inaccurate reporting. Legal standing requires a demonstrable injury, which can be a high bar in privacy cases where harm may be intangible, such as unauthorized data collection. Courts often grapple with whether individuals have suffered concrete injury sufficient to bring suit. For learners, these terms highlight the difference between laws that rely on government enforcement and those that empower individuals directly. They also demonstrate why enforcement outcomes vary dramatically across statutes. Some empower private lawsuits broadly, while others restrict enforcement to agencies alone. Federal regulatory authorities anchor privacy enforcement at the national level. The Federal Trade Commission is the most prominent, using its Section 5 authority against unfair or deceptive practices to regulate privacy broadly. The Department of Health and Human Services enforces HIPAA and healthcare, while the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau oversees aspects of financial privacy. Other agencies, such as the Federal Communications Commission, play narrower roles in telecommunications. Each agency brings its own expertise, enforcement mechanisms, and remedies, from administrative orders to financial penalties. For candidates, recognizing which agency governs which area is essential, since exam questions often hinge on identifying the appropriate regulator. These distinctions also prepare professionals for practice, where knowing the correct agency to engage with is central to compliance strategy. State attorneys general and specialized agencies like the California Privacy Protection Agency expand enforcement at the state level. Attorneys general frequently bring cases under state consumer protection statutes, often coordinating with federal regulators. California's creation of a dedicated privacy agency reflects growing state-level ambition to regulate directly, setting a precedent for other states. These entities wield significant power, from issuing fines to enforcing transparency obligations. For learners, awareness of these state roles emphasizes that compliance cannot focus only on federal requirements. Instead, organizations must navigate dual enforcement landscapes, where both federal and state authorities may act. This reinforces the patchwork nature of U.S. privacy law and highlights the importance of staying attuned to state-level developments that may evolve faster than federal statutes. Self-regulatory models add another layer to privacy governance. Industries often develop codes of conduct, certification frameworks, or trust marks to demonstrate responsible data practices. For example, advertising networks may adopt self-regulatory guidelines for behavioral targeting, enforced through industry bodies rather than government. While these models lack the force of law, they serve as signals of accountability and can mitigate regulatory scrutiny. They also shape industry norms, influencing what consumers expect and what regulators view as best practices. For learners, recognizing the role of self-regulation clarifies why the U.S. system is often described as sectoral and pluralistic. It also illustrates how non-governmental mechanisms contribute to the privacy ecosystem, complementing legal mandates with voluntary commitments that still carry significant reputational consequences. The accountability principle underlies many privacy frameworks, requiring organizations not only to comply with rules, but to demonstrate compliance actively. This means keeping records, conducting assessments, and documenting processes. For example, an organization may implement a data protection program, but must also be able to show regulators or partners evidence of its operation. Accountability transforms compliance from a reactive stance to a proactive culture, where organizations anticipate scrutiny and prepare defensible practices. For candidates, this principle explains why many exam terms, such as audits, assessments, and documentation, appear repeatedly. It also highlights a shift in privacy governance. Being compliant is not enough unless compliance can be proven. This expectation has become central to both enforcement and professional practice. Data inventory and classification are technical-sounding terms but form the backbone of privacy programs. A data inventory catalogs what data an organization collects, processes, and stores, while classification assigns sensitivity levels to that data. Personally identifiable information, financial data, and health records may be classified at higher risk levels, requiring stricter controls. Without inventory and classification, organizations cannot apply rules effectively, as they lack visibility into what they hold. For learners, these terms underscore why foundational controls are essential. Laws may mandate protections, but organizations must first know what they are protecting. On the exam, questions about program design often assume candidates understand that inventory and classification are prerequisites for compliance. In practice, these tools enable prioritization, resource allocation, and defensible decision-making. Data flow mapping extends inventory by visualizing how information moves within and outside an organization. It shows where data is collected, where it is stored, who accesses it, and how it is shared with third parties. Flow mapping reveals vulnerabilities, such as uncontrolled transfers or insufficient safeguards for vendors. For example, mapping might show that personal data flows from a website to a third-party analytics provider, raising questions about contractual obligations and disclosures. For candidates, this term highlights the operational complexity behind compliance. Knowing where data travels is necessary to apply laws and contracts effectively. On the exam, flow mapping often appears as a foundational control linked to transparency, vendor management, and accountability, reinforcing its central role in privacy programs. Privacy notices, preference management, and consent transparency represent the visible interface of compliance. Notices explain to individuals what data is collected and how it is used. Preference management allows them to set choices, and transparency ensures consent is informed and meaningful. Together, these terms illustrate how privacy obligations translate into user-facing practices. For example, a notice might inform users about tracking cookies, while a preference center allows them to opt out, and transparency requires that the language be clear and not misleading. For learners, these terms emphasize that privacy law is not only about internal governance but also about respecting and empowering individuals. Questions in this area test understanding of both legal mandates and practical implementation, bridging the gap between law and user experience. Data retention and secure disposal terms capture the principle that personal information should not be kept longer than necessary. Retention policies define how long data is stored, while secure disposal ensures it is destroyed when no longer needed. For example, financial institutions may be required to retain records for regulatory purposes, but must then dispose of them securely to prevent misuse. These practices reduce exposure by limiting the amount of data available for breach or misuse. For candidates, these terms highlight the life cycle approach to data, where obligations extend from collection to final deletion. On the exam, retention and disposal questions test both legal compliance and practical controls, reminding learners that privacy responsibilities endure beyond initial collection. International transfer mechanisms, such as standard contractual clauses and the EU-US Data Privacy Framework, provide lawful pathways for moving personal data across borders. These terms highlight the global nature of privacy, where U.S. organizations must often comply with foreign requirements when handling European data. SCCs are contractual commitments to maintain adequate protection, while the Data Privacy Framework provides a government-level arrangement recognized by the European Union. For learners, these mechanisms illustrate how U.S. privacy practice intersects with international law, making global awareness essential. On the exam, understanding these terms ensures candidates can navigate questions involving cross-border transfers, where compliance depends on recognizing both domestic and international obligations. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. The Federal Trade Commission sits at the center of U.S. federal privacy enforcement. Its authority derives primarily from Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, which prohibits unfair or deceptive acts and practices. In the privacy context, this broad mandate allows the FTC to bring cases against companies that misrepresent their data practices or fail to provide reasonable security. For example, if an organization promises to protect customer information but then experiences a breach due to inadequate safeguards, the FTC may argue that this is both deceptive and unfair. Remedies often include consent decrees, requiring ongoing oversight and reporting. On the exam, the FTC's role is foundational because it acts as the default privacy regulator in the absence of a comprehensive federal statute, filling gaps with enforcement that shapes business norms across multiple sectors. The Children's Online Privacy Protection Act illustrates how sector-specific federal laws establish detailed obligations. COPPA applies to operators of websites or online services directed at children under 13, as well as those with actual knowledge of collecting such data. A central requirement is verifiable parental consent before collecting personal information from children. The law also restricts the type and amount of data that can be gathered, reflecting heightened sensitivity around minors. For candidates, key terms include verifiable parental consent, which requires more than a simple checkbox, and obligations for clear notices to parents. Exam questions often probe whether a scenario triggers COPPA's scope, emphasizing the importance of understanding how this law balances parental rights, business operations, and the protection of children in digital environments. HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, introduces privacy obligations in healthcare. The privacy rule governs the use and disclosure of protected health information, setting limits on when data may be shared without patient authorization. Covered entities such as healthcare providers and insurers must provide notices of privacy practices and allow patients access to their records. Permitted uses include treatment, payment, and healthcare operations, but anything beyond these requires authorization. On the exam, HIPAA terminology often focuses on definitions: covered entity, business associate, and protected health information. Recognizing these terms is essential, since exam stems may test whether a particular organization or activity falls within HIPAA's scope. HIPAA demonstrates how federal privacy laws are narrowly tailored to sectors but carry extensive obligations within their domains. Complementing the privacy rule, the HIPAA security rule focuses specifically on electronic protected health information. It establishes administrative, physical, and technical safeguards to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Administrative safeguards include risk assessments and workforce training. Physical safeguards involve facility access controls, and technical safeguards encompass encryption and authentication. Together, they create a layered defense against unauthorized access or disclosure. For exam purposes, candidates must remember that the security rule applies only to electronic data, not all forms of health information. The rule illustrates how privacy and security intersect. Compliance is not only about limiting disclosures, but also about preventing breaches through robust controls. This integrated approach underscores the practical reality that privacy cannot exist without security infrastructure to support it. The Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, or HITECH, expanded HIPAA by strengthening breach notification requirements and enforcement mechanisms. Covered entities and business associates must notify individuals, regulators, and in some cases the media when breaches of protected health information occur. High-tech also introduced higher penalties for non-compliance, raising the stakes for healthcare organizations. On the exam, questions may focus on the distinction between HIPAA's foundational rules and HITECH's enhancements. For example, HITECH clarified that business associates are directly liable for compliance, closing gaps in earlier frameworks. This law illustrates how Congress adapts sector-specific privacy regimes to address technological change, reinforcing that privacy frameworks evolve alongside new risks and practices in information management. The 21st Century Cures Act introduced concepts of interoperability and information blocking in healthcare. Its goal is to improve patient access to electronic health records while preventing practices that hinder data sharing. Interoperability requires systems to communicate effectively, while information blocking rules prohibit organizations from unreasonably limiting access or exchange. For learners, this terminology demonstrates the tension between protecting privacy and enabling beneficial data use. Exam questions may test whether candidates recognize these dual priorities, safeguarding sensitive health information while ensuring that patients and providers can share it for legitimate purposes. The Cures Act shows that privacy law is not static, but constantly balancing new technological opportunities against risks, an ongoing theme across the broader U.S. privacy landscape. Special protections exist for substance use disorder treatment records under 42 Code of Federal Regulations Part 2. These rules impose stricter confidentiality requirements than general health privacy frameworks, reflecting the stigma and potential consequences of disclosure. Patient consent is required for most disclosures, even for treatment purposes that HIPAA would otherwise allow. For candidates, key terms include the heightened standard of consent and the focus on specific facilities receiving federal assistance. Exam questions may present scenarios contrasting HIPAA and Part 2 requirements, testing whether candidates recognize that stricter rules apply in this sensitive context. These protections highlight how federal privacy law tailors safeguards to areas of heightened vulnerability, ensuring that trust in treatment programs is not undermined by fear of exposure. The Fair Credit Reporting Act governs the collection, use, and dissemination of consumer reports. Its terms include accuracy, access, and permissible purpose. Consumers have the right to access their reports, dispute inaccuracies, and limit disclosures to situations with a legitimate purpose, such as credit evaluation. The FCRA empowers both regulators and private individuals to enforce compliance, making it a powerful tool for consumer protection. Exam stems may test knowledge of permissible purposes, such as employment background checks, which require explicit consent. The statute illustrates how privacy in the financial domain balances business needs for information with individual rights to fairness and transparency. Recognizing these terms ensures candidates can navigate the details of consumer credit privacy effectively. The Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act, or FACTA, amends the FCRA to address identity theft risks. Key terms include requirements for truncation of credit card numbers on receipts and provisions for fraud alerts in consumer credit files. FACTA emphasizes preventative measures, reducing opportunities for identity thieves to misuse data. For learners, understanding FACTA highlights the evolution of financial privacy toward proactive risk mitigation. Exam questions may focus on specific provisions, such as the red flags rule, which is closely related to FACTA's emphasis on detection and prevention. Together, FCRA and FACTA represent a layered approach to financial privacy, one focused on consumer rights to accuracy and fairness, and the other on protecting against fraud and identity theft. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act introduces both a privacy rule and a safeguards rule. The privacy rule requires financial institutions to provide clear privacy notices and allow consumers to opt out of certain data sharing with non-affiliated third parties. This rule emphasizes transparency and choice, making opt-out a key term. The Safeguards Rule requires institutions to implement comprehensive security programs, including risk assessments, employee training, and monitoring of third-party service providers. For candidates, remembering the distinction between the privacy rule's focus on notice and choice and the Safeguards Rule's focus on security is critical. Exam stems may test whether a described obligation is disclosure-related or security-related. GLBA illustrates how federal privacy laws frequently combine transparency obligations with operational requirements, reflecting a holistic approach to consumer protection. The Identity Theft Red Flags Rule further develops identity protection obligations. It requires certain financial institutions and creditors to implement programs that detect, prevent, and mitigate identity theft. Key terms include red flags, which are patterns, practices, or specific activities indicating potential fraud. For learners, this rule highlights the expectation that organizations monitor actively for warning signs rather than waiting for harm to occur. Exam questions may describe scenarios where red flags are present, testing whether candidates recognize the need for preventative action. This rule demonstrates how privacy protection extends beyond static compliance to dynamic monitoring, aligning with the broader accountability principle that organizations must anticipate risks and respond proactively. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, expanding federal oversight in financial privacy. The CFPB has authority to regulate practices affecting consumers, including those involving financial data. For exam preparation, key terms include the CFPB's role and its overlap with other regulators, such as the FTC. This dual oversight reinforces the fragmented but robust nature of U.S. privacy law, where multiple agencies share responsibility. Understanding Dodd-Frank and the CFPB ensures candidates can navigate financial privacy questions with precision, recognizing which regulator holds authority in a given context. This law illustrates how privacy obligations continue to evolve in response to systemic risks and consumer protection concerns. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act establishes rights for students regarding education records. FERPA grants students and parents the right to access records, request corrections, and control disclosure. Institutions must secure consent before releasing identifiable education information, with exceptions for legitimate educational interests. For candidates, key terms include education records and directory information, as well as the balance between institutional duties and individual rights. Exam stems may test whether a particular disclosure is permissible under FERPA's framework. This statute highlights how privacy law extends into education, reinforcing the theme that U.S. federal privacy laws are not comprehensive but sector-specific, each tailored to the sensitivities and risks of its domain. By mastering the glossary of domains 1 and 2, candidates gain fluency in the actors, controls, and statutes that form the foundation of U.S. privacy law. These terms are not isolated definitions, but components of an interlocking system that balances consumer protection, business needs, and government oversight. Building competence in this vocabulary prepares learners not only to succeed on the exam, but to practice effectively in the diverse and evolving field of privacy. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.